everyone. Welcome to another episode of UX Pathways. And I have the honor of being joined by Dr. Karl Fast. How are you today?
I'm well. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to have you here. You've had a very interesting career. Could you tell me your journey and what is your current role in the industry?
So I'll start with my current role, which is none. I haven't done any UX work for a number of years now due to things like the pandemic and remote work, but also my wife has the primary job. We've had like a health crisis, like my got a son, and so we do a lot of focusing around that. But I'm not out of it in any way, at least in terms of my thinking about it. And
Hmm.
so we'll go through some of that. My career goes back like way back. I started in 1994. I came out of engineering physics and I started working as a research engineer on a satellite project. And we had a huge amount of data to deal with this satellite, and I was on the data handling project. And I'd been using the internet on a daily basis since 1991. And I started building websites that summer in 1994 because it seemed like the perfect tool for the problem that I was facing, which was going to be a large amount of data and needing to provide access to not just the people in our research group, but people at about like 8 or 10 different universities across Canada, the Canadian Space Agency, plus people in Sweden and France and Finland who are also going to be working off of this data. And so the web was like this hugely critical piece for doing this. Um, so I start building websites about 6, 8 months after Mosaic, the first graphical web browser, comes out, and about 6 months before Netscape, the first commercial web browser, comes out. I mean, this is for context. That's a more than a year before Internet Explorer first releases, and a year and a half before Apple publishes finally gets Safari out the door. So I'm building database-backed websites, and I had a very huge insight early on, which was I could make it work technically. And coming out of engineering and physics, you think in sort of the technical side of it, the building side of it, the making side of it. It had never occurred to me that I could make something that if I understood it, that other people couldn't. And that is precisely what happened. Like I could make this thing, but they struggled to find the information in it that they needed to. And so I went looking for different ideas. Where could I find something that would help me solve this problem? I couldn't even get a good name on the problem, right? I'm articulating it now in a way which seems really obvious, but back then it was hard to know. We didn't have a term called user experience. Nobody really did this. I found stuff in two areas, both of them useless. Um, there was human computer interaction, which seemed like it should have been good, but it assumed, like a whole set of rich interaction widgets, low latency on the desktop. You could do all these different types of things. And the web was not like that. And then there was graphic design, which was pouring into the web, but they wanted the web to be like print. And this is like 6 years before the first 5 or 6 years before CSS comes out. It's before JavaScript. Like it's just pathetic. Um, so they were trying to make the web something that it would eventually be, but was years away from being that way. And then in 1998, a book comes out called Information Architecture for the World Wide Web, the Polar Bear book, as it's often called. And that that was the book that opened everything up. And the argument there was the web is not an application space. Your desktop's an application space. The web would become an application space, but back then the web was fundamentally an information space. And there was an area where you could take ideas from information spaces that were applicable. It was libraries, museums, and archives. All these ideas about how do you organize information, how do you facilitate search, how do you label things so that people can understand what might be behind a link or inside a category, how do you design a navigation system. And their core insight was if we take these ideas and bring them out of these traditional institutions and the context of the problem they are solving, they had huge application everywhere else, and especially on the web. And so that's when information architecture started. And that opened up a whole new world for me. I eventually wound up working at that company for a short time. And then we got caught up in the dot-com crash, even though we didn't have dot-com clients. And I wound up going back to graduate school specifically to do library and information science. And I went in with a pretty mercenary attitude. I wanted to learn from people who had deep knowledge about these things that I had been practicing so that I could get much better at things like taxonomy development, metadata design, right? And try to connect that. And I would go into those classes, listening to them talk and translating into my mind to the
Hmm.
problems that I was actually facing on the web with clients, with design teams. Um, and then I took a class on information visualization from a professor in computer science. And this was another big turning point for me. Um, it was all about how do you create information where you present it in a different form, which is easier to understand, especially in a visual form. And then through interacting with that visual information, you can come to understand it more deeply. You can get more out of it rather than just reading words and clicking links. And I wound up sticking around to do a PhD. I read a bunch of stuff in psychology, particularly in cognitive science, and in this area of cognitive science called distributed cognition or embodied cognition. Another term these days would be used as the extended mind. I remember reading that paper shortly, a few years after it had come out, and that was another big sort of moment around this idea of, oh, we have this really weird idea about what's about cognition, about how we think, which is that thinking, the critique of all of those, broadly speaking, is that we think in thinking is what happens in the head. We perceive information from the world. We think inside with our the gray goo in our skull, and then we act on the world as a result. And these were arguing that no. Perception and action are very much bound up in the whole process of thinking and understanding and sense making and decision making and problem solving and planning. You can't do it all in the head. You can do quite a few things, but you can never do it all. And that really changed my perspective on design in an enormous way. Um, I planned to go back at that point into the corporate world, but I got an unexpected offer, or a position opened up at Kent State University. The library school there had started a new program in what they called information architecture and knowledge management. It was very small. It was very new. I'd been around for 5 or 6 years, but it was still very small. And it was a graduate program. And they were looking for a new faculty member. And I applied and I got the job. And that was how we would have met, how we met long ago. Um,
Yes.
I and so I taught there for 7 years. And by the end of that, we had moved the program fully online. There were reasons why that was the best thing for the program in terms of sustainability and growth and making it financially viable, really. Um, and and just as we were moving it to be a 100% online, then that's when I wound up leaving the university. We moved from there. We moved to Minneapolis. I went back to do more independent work. I worked with a company in Toronto called Normative Design for the next 6 years. But my wife had the full-time job, and she's been in this field for a long time as well, running teams. Um, Along with that, then I also wrote a book. Co-wrote a book with Steven Anderson called Figure It Out, Getting from Information to Understanding. And that book, Steven invited me because of the work that I had done around interaction for understanding and these notions about how we interact with information as part of our cognitive apparatus. So that's a very unusual journey compared to most people, which is, you know, I wound up getting a job as a UX designer, making wireframes, et cetera. And like I work in a team inside this, at an agency, and then by after the iPhone, it became in-house work, and I'm
Hmm.
running design teams, and like I'm managing these projects. Like I don't do any of that stuff. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the thing that got me and I wrote down was learning deep knowledge. And I felt that seems to be a thread there. It's like you continually wanted to learn, and then you even went back to school to learn even more and then learn from others. And then as you went even further, you wrote a book, and that's a whole learning process as well. I've been down that path myself. For you, I mean, thinking about that, it sounds like you had a lot of moments in there where things, dropped. There was a couple books where it clicked and you kind of moved down
Mm-hmm.
different paths.
Mm-hmm. Those aren't the only ones. There are several other ones too, but those were
Okay.
definitely big ones. Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things was an important one very early on.
Hmm.
Another book of his actually, in many ways, was probably the most influential because of a line that he uses about midway through. It's called "Things That Make Us Smart." My
Hmm.
dissertation advisor used to say, "Design of Everyday Things" is the book that Norman is famous for, and justly so. It's the most influential book. But he would say the most profound book that he ever wrote is "Things That Make Us Smart," and particularly because of a passage. It's around 40 pages. The line is basically the power of the unaided human mind is greatly exaggerated. We think with things, we think with the world around us. And without those kinds of things, all of human cognition is constrained. Reasoning, memory, everything that we do is limited. And that gave me a completely different perspective on the purpose, the possibilities of design. It's not just about making
Hmm.
things easier for people, right? It is about, or it can be about, um, how do we truly build strong connections between people and the tools that we have? And by making those tools, we become smarter. By making those tools allow us to connect with other people and think in groups. But we have so long discounted the role of interaction with physical things, physical space, all of these kinds of things. We just don't have a very good vocabulary for it. And to this day, I don't think that user experience has a very rich vocabulary for this at all, no matter how rich our vocabulary around interaction is. Because I think most of interaction design is really like, well, I got a palette of widgets in whatever design tool I'm using. This is what I can use. I can, put some radio buttons in. I can do these check boxes. I can make stuff, but it's not really connected to this bigger idea of how interaction, our bodies, physical space is a powerful part of how we think and reason and plan and solve and understand and reason.
It's an ecosystem, which
Yeah.
I remember recently I finally went back and I looked at the systems thinking book that was
Mm.
out there by
Donna Meadows.
yes, right, exactly. And that was one for me that, you're talking about books that really opened my mind and started thinking about that kind of end-to-end experience. And you mentioned user experience a couple times. Is that the definition to you? It seems like it's a combination between the, I guess, interaction costs and the holistic experience. Where do you land on that? Like, how would you define that to someone that was just getting into this field?
I User experience is so first let me step back.
Of course.
I think the definitions are hard. And I
Yes.
think that when definitions are easy, that means it's also uninteresting and not very important. I started in the library program, and the first class you have to take is Fundamentals of Library and Information Science. Okay. Second class is what is information? We go down and there's just this long thing there where people comes out and it's like information is all these different types of things. It's an object, it's a knowledge, it's a process. There's a variety of different types of things. And we go down after the class and the grad student lounge is just down the hall. And so we go down and, all these people I've just met, we don't have a drink. And one of the guys says, I can't believe it. This is ridiculous. I've signed up for a program in library and information science, and they can't even tell me what information is. And I immediately said, like, I disagree with that. I think the fact that there is no clear cut definition of information is actually the point. I came out of engineering and physics. We thought, right, in physics, that certain ideas like time were really straightforward. Matter, energy, space. But like Einstein showed us that no, 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 no. Time is really complicated. And in fact, it's so complicated that time and space are the same thing. It's called space. He called it space time, one word. If you talk to a biologist and you say, what is life? They're like, actually, we don't know. We really don't have a good definition of what is life. We have working definitions, right? But we don't have, for interesting topic areas, really good, crisp, solid definitions about these things. And in fact, for information, we basically have two. We have this idea of like the everyday idea of information that we all kind of use. And then there's the Claude Shannon information theory definition of it, which is exists to strip out semantics so that you can quantify information. And then you can do math with it. And this has been transformative for so many of the sciences. You talk to people in like, um, you almost everyone. Economics is like an information science. You think of information as something that can be quantified. You talk to biologists, DNA is quantified information. All of these things use information theory to understand their field, but that's not how we talk about information in every day. So when it comes to
Hmm.
user experience, I don't really care about that definition in this
Hmm.
in sort of what it really means. I think there's useful definitions, and I think the most useful definition is that it is vague in a useful way that allows people who need the work done but don't understand it to say, yeah, 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 that thing. Like in 19, for a longest
Hmm.
time before
Hmm.
UX became the term for this field, one of the hardest things was convincing people, explaining to people what we did and convincing them that it was valuable. Like if you came into this field anytime in the last 20 years, that problem was solved for you, more or less. But for the first 10 years of this field, like, no. We had long debates about what we should call it. Should this thing be called information architecture? Should it be called interaction design? You know, all of these were too specific in many ways. They pointed you in too much of a direction. So UX to me is defined as sort of this umbrella term, which allowed all of the different disciplines that did aspects, important aspects of this work, and put it under one thing that the people who needed the work done could go, yeah, that thing.
And it's interesting as you refer to a couple of books there, and I remember that polar bear book when that came out. I I couldn't stop just exploring more about that subject matter,
Mhm.
and it really made things clear. There's another one, Jesse James Garrett, that came out as well, which was the elements of experience. That also is like, oh, there's all these layers below there, and that's how I need to think about it. So I think you're right. It's like all this came together. It's it's continually changing. It is challenging. And I love the fact you keep referencing these books because to me, and we were talking about this before we started, that it has been challenging for me to continually push myself to keep reading. And I have recently started going more down the audiobook, but you were telling me that that is the one main way that you learn.
It is. I do read a lot, but I actually, for nonfiction, actually for many things, I don't actually listen to audiobooks. I understand the appeal for a lot of people, but I
Hmm.
can't do nonfiction with audiobooks. And the main reason is because I'm always taking notes.
Highlighting and updating.
I don't highlight. I actually write with a piece. I have like paper next to me. And
Hmm.
so I will pause and set the book down and I will make notes and I will reference a particular page. I can scribble more different types of things. And then later I go through and take those kinds of notes and put them into a bigger system and process that. Sometimes I never get back to the book because I read so many things. And there's just, and sometimes a lot of those notes get stripped away, but I want notes where I've processed them, where it's not just I've
Mm.
highlighted something in the book, but I often need to articulate it in a way that's more useful to me. I need to connect it to other kinds of things. Sometimes it's really useful to read a book and not make the notes on it for about 6 months. Because then notes that
Hmm.
seemed more important in the moment, now they're less important. I've got perspective on something. It's a little bit like when you
Interesting.
see, if you reread a book, you see it maybe in a different way, not because the book has changed, but because the world has changed and because you have changed. Or seeing a film. I remember I'm a big film person, and I remember when the Stanley Kubrick film Eyes Wide Shut came out, and I had been too young to see his previous film, Full Metal Jacket. And I thought, man, this is like the last time I'm ever going to get to see a brand new Kubrick film in the theaters. And so I went to see it. And I went to see it 2 or 3 times. And I remember thinking very clearly, oh, I got to watch this again because this is a film about marriage. and a deep relationship. And it's a very complicated film. And I'm going to have to watch this again when I get much older. And maybe I'll have been married by for a long time at that point. And so it came to a local theater here a couple of years ago, and I did go see it, and I saw it twice, and I was like, oh yeah, this is my world. I have changed a lot. I have been married at that point for like 18 years. Like, yes, this film lands very differently, and I think it's the same kind of thing with books about ideas.
Mm. Moment to reflect. And I, it's interesting. I've done that a couple times too. I've read a couple of books twice and I've come back to it. A lot of it was because just like we were here quoting something, it's like, am I getting that quote down right? Because there's
Mm-hmm.
some points where I can remember the page number. It's like, on page 45, I think this paragraph, there was
Yep.
one specifically, I think it was by Steve Krug. It's like rocket surgery made easy. There's
Mm-hmm.
some line in there where he says, you really don't need to test with actual users. And then there's an exclamation point that says, well, if it's a very specific application, yes, but it's in like,
Yep.
it's kind of in fine print.
Yeah.
And I had people quote that. I'd have to come back to that and say, well, let me go back and make sure I've got the right page number. But
Yeah.
that is interesting how you talked about your journey. And one thing that I've been fascinated about in this season has been around how we change, how we adapt, and I'm interested what your approach is to that because it seems as though, as you were talking about, is it's always been about learning. That seems to
Mm-hmm.
be what's pushing it. Is that what's driving your philosophy and the way you adapt to change?
Well, I how can I put this? If I'm not reading, something's off. Like things have gone, I just have a need to be taking in different kinds of ideas. I actually keep lists of the books, a list of the books that I've read, and I group everything into three major categories. One, I just read it. It's called enjoy, is the first category. I'm just reading this purely for pleasure.
Hmm.
And although even then, if it's, it's some sort of, this is mostly going to be fiction. Um, Even then, it's something where, especially if it's a more thoughtful book, if it's more literature than just, straight fiction, it will have something that will teach me something. And so I do read it for some ideas in that sense. But primarily, I'm not going into it thinking I'm going to take notes, right? Um, the second category is what I call better. This is where I'm learning to do something. I just know how to do something, or I don't know anything at all, but I need to learn how to do something. I'm trying to gain a skill of some sort, right? So, read a book about note taking, or I'm going to read a book about like how to something about cooking so I can make some different kinds of food or whatever. But the
Hmm.
point of that is to improve a skill that I have or acquire a skill that I would like to have. So, certain classes of AI books, for example, will be more skill based. Right? I used to write a lot of Python code. So a book that gives me certain types of tooling so that I can work through, oh, this is what the libraries do. This is the tooling that works, and this is how I can leverage it. That's very different than the third category of books, which I read, which I just call ideas. So I
Hmm.
am immediately on my mind, like if I'm reading stuff about AI, I can put those books, I would have three different reasons that I might want to be reading them, all of which might feed ideas. But a lot of AI books, there's a lot of short books that I'm working my way through now, which is basically how to think about AI, how to think about the disruption that is going to change, how to change your understanding of software. Then there's another class of books which are how to get better at it, how to use it to do something. And they've got lots of code examples. And then the third things might be science fiction books or other types of things, enjoyment books where they have sort of a futuristic sci-fi speculative bent, which might also help me understand things about the moment that we are in. Now, I do read a lot of, most of the fiction is just for enjoyment. For sure. But that's how I kind of classify stuff. And a
Hmm.
lot of the books that we have mentioned and talked about so far, a lot of them really fall into the idea book. And it's not ideas in terms of here's a bunch of facts, right?
Hmm.
It's things that the best books are ones that help me see things in a different way. Maybe they bring into focus something that I had never thought about at all before. Maybe they take things that are familiar to me, that the world is changing, my life is changing, my job is changing, And it helps me see that in a new perspective, helps me understand things. And that helps me grow.
Now I've had a lot of people who said audiobooks is not your preference. Are you print? Are you more of a Kindle kind of person? Is it a
I am
mixture?
almost exclusively print. I will read fiction for on a Kindle. That's totally fine. And I read some nonfiction. I have been looking at some of the new e-ink readers that are out, the ones from Books
Mhm.
and the Kindle Scribe and the Remarkable, things like that. A lot of that really is maybe for some of the bigger books, but also a lot more for academic papers. The Kindle's terrible for that. You just can't do it. The iPad is fine. The great thing about the e-ink devices and the Kindle is not what they can do. I mean, it's partly that, but it's a lot of what they can't do. I was talking with a friend of mine the other day,
Interesting.
and he said, you know, he agreed with me. He was like, he says, like, there's a lot of stuff I don't like. I don't like to read on my iPad. And he said, it's not because the reading is bad. It's because I might decide to go check my email. I might read a passage and think, oh, I should go search for something. And that's just going to like go off. What I should be doing is I should be immersing myself in the book. And it doesn't help me do that. And so we were talking about whether or not an e-ink, one of these new e-ink tablets, this current generation would be worth it for that. And so I'm looking at those specifically to understand how would they help me with that, or are they just going to have a whole bunch of bells and whistles that are just going to be a distraction?
Yeah, I mean, that's to me, I'm the same way. Like, I can't have anything else on. I have to be in a quiet environment and reading and focusing,
Yeah.
and any of those distractions can throw me off. But it sounds
Mhm.
like so then the way that you've been able to kind of move and adapt is through reading, through immersing yourself and keeping that going. You mentioned artificial
Let
intelligence.
me add one thing
Sure.
specifically about that. You just triggered
Hmm.
some,
Of course.
because my journey is quite different. I think for many people, the way that they adapt to change is because they're always doing. Right? Like you're using the tools. I don't use Figma, right? Like I'm not embedded in a design team. I'm not solving those kinds of problems. And so that means that I'm doing other kinds of things, and I have time in my life to read, and I also have a cognitive need to be doing this as well. Like I said, I feel kind of off, so that's why I get through 60 or 70 books in a year. Plus, I don't even know how many academic papers I'll read through in some fashion. So I'm in a
Hmm.
different situation. But then I'm also thinking, I also see myself as someone who provides a very different kind of value to people in UX because of that. What I do is I'm I know the profession. I know the kinds of things that people work with. I've done that kind of work. I've taught people, but I can help them frame and change things. So I'm not suggesting that anybody should be like, oh my God, I really feel guilty about. The thing about reading is people feel really guilty about what they have not read. Like they feel guilty. They know that reading is a good thing. But the reality is it's very hard to make time for it, certainly at the scale that someone like I do. Um, and so in many ways, I view myself as more of like this independent scholar, researcher type. I don't write a whole lot right now. I've just had lots of other types of things, but that's the kind of work that I do around trying to
Hmm.
um, think about what this is and how I can communicate this to other people to help them change their understanding of things, help them see it in a different way.
You start off by saying always doing, and that is definitely what you're doing, Carl. It
Yeah.
is inspirational to me. I mean, I recently took the Strength Finder, and they have a bunch of qualities, and it said learning was the top thing on my list.
Hmm.
So there's something in me that and to me, books is part of that. And you mentioned, I was going to get into this, you mentioned talking about artificial intelligence, and I have been asking everyone, what is that the
Sure.
hype in the industry that can't be ignored? And I've had a couple of people say, well, haven't you already given me the answer? But I did have a couple of guests say, well, no, it actually isn't AI. It's this. Is there something that you think that's currently out there that we just can't ignore?
Well, I mean, I I would disagree with the idea that we can ignore AI or that
Hmm.
it's not that important. And the main reason for that, I mean, I think AI is the obvious one, but I think there's a lot more nuance. And what we are missing is a lot of the different kinds of nuance around the AI shift. The first thing is around AI is it was always going to be something.
Mhm.
The tech industry has always operated on these big shifts that happen every 12, 15, 17 years. This is the story of digital technology. We started doing computers and we had like mainframes became a thing. And then there was this shift to mini computers, right? Which were like the size of a fridge instead of like taking up a whole house. Then you had a shift from mini computers to PCs, which seemed hugely underpowered, right? Then we had a shift from PCs to the web, which was really, in many ways, a shift of saying, hey, we should take all the networking technologies that organization use to connect their PCs together. And like, this is super valuable. And we should wire up. Everybody should be connected. All computers should be connected. Then the next shift was the shift to mobile. And now, like ever since then, we've had these are all massive platform shifts, right? And each of these have been a hardware type of situation or a major sort of software piece around that. We've expanded access to this. And now what we're doing is we're doing the shift to AI. It is important to understand that starting about 10 years ago, everyone in the Valley started looking for the next big thing. They were all looking for the next big thing because they know this pattern. What was it going to be? For a long time, it was going to be blockchain. A lot of people put their money on blockchain. Meta has put tens of billions of dollars that it's going to be VR. Apple built built the Vision Pro, betting that, it's going to be, well, first it was wearables, right, with the watch, and then it was going to be um, augmented reality. And all of these were like kind of right. Drones. Some people thought drones would be the next big thing, or self-driving cars. And those are all big-ish things for sure. Um, but none of them is big the way AI is big. Because AI is the thing that is bigger than the smartphone. All of those other things are big and probably in many cases bigger than the web, or at least bigger than the PC, certainly in terms of numbers. There's like about 1.5 billion PCs in the world that get replaced every 3 to 5 years. We've got like 6 billion smartphones in the world, or 5 or 6 billion that get replaced every 2 to 3 years. So AI is the one that is bigger. However, when people talk about AI, we talk about it in this sort of monolithic way, as though it is hitting every different industry and every different area in the same way, but it's not. If you're in like certain sciences, I think what is happening to a lot of people, this is a very powerful boost to what you do because it's a pattern finding technology, right? And it finds it, you can use it and train it on unique niche data sets to find patterns that would just be way too time consuming to do this. One way to look at the story of science is people do breakthroughs for doing incredibly tedious work to find something to collect data. Like think about like Darwin. He spends several years on the Beagle collecting fauna and then like 10 years or whatever it is, writing it all up and trying to figure out what it means. 2 years just to collect the data. Like, and this is the story all the way through of so many different types of things. And then like 10 years, like take the Human Genome Project. The amount of work that went into mapping the first human genome is enormous. And now like you can just buy one. You can just buy one and like put it on your desk. And it's a gene sequencing device is less than your car. So in certain areas, AI is more of a boost. But right now we're talking about in tech and in UX in a way of like it's killing our jobs. It's just this transforming thing. And I don't think that that is necessarily wrong. I think there's going to be a lot of stuff, but even there, we're missing a lot of nuance around how we talk about it. So broadly, I think that what the hype around AI is often missing is that it's not the same thing in every different area. It's not the same thing for every different job. And in our area and the kinds of things that we do, I think we're really missing the role that it will play in designing and building products. I think you have, an old story. If you go back, it's not, you have to go back that far, really, right? I mentioned before that a lot of times in early UX, we had a problem explaining to people what we did. This is
Hmm.
what information architecture is. This is why you need a usability, do usability testing. This is why you need content strategy, right? And UX gave us a bigger picture thing so that all of these could kind of fit underneath and would be like, okay, right? Um, but often we were also fighting against technology because in many organizations, technology, right, the engineers have the power. In some organizations, it's sales, right? They have the power. In some organizations, it really is like executives, like whoever has the most money. Um, right? The biggest product line has the big power. But right now, I think you've got this thing where a lot of engineering people are saying, we don't need designers anymore because I can just build the whole thing. But they don't understand the nuance, right? The importance. They don't have the ability to judge an interface to see whether or not it's good. And they're assuming that there is no value in research about what customers need. And so we're in that sense, engineers are taking power and we're going right back to before UX got started, where they have all the power and nobody else needs anything. There's a classic book that I recommend. This is another book in the early days. It wasn't really enlightening for me, but it hit the nail on the head. And that was The Inmates Are Running the Asylum by Alan Cooper. And his argument was he was writing the business case essentially for user experience. You need this because programmers don't understand people. They don't understand their customers. They're too close to the machine. You need to separate these roles. And what's happening now is you've got executives, you've got business leaders who have forgotten that if they ever understood it. And they've got engineers with gaining more power. Look at how much we can do, and we can do this faster, and we can build this product for you, and it's going to be great. On the other hand, we also have like product people are caught in this as well. Why would I need? Like I can do this without the engineer. I can do this without the designer. And designers can be like, well, it can produce the code for me. So we've got this big weird situation here. And depending on which organization you're in, depending on what products you make, depending on the culture, depending on how the power balances are, I think this is upending a lot of the power balances in organizations, at least from the things I'm reading and the people I've been talking to. And so I feel like there's a lot of aspects to this, a lot of nuance in the AI hype, and that is what is really being often missed. And that happens when you've got a lot of fear and anxiety.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's generally in that nuance, as you were talking about. That's where that decision is that I found is it's those little tiny things that, especially when you're building, we talk about system environment, products, some type of experience. It's generally those little things that that's where someone gets stuck. And that's
Mhm.
and that's where someone makes that phone call to the company and they put it on a social media platform. So it is interesting how you talked about finding patterns and the power of it and the role it needs to play. And I think everyone is trying to get into that position to figure out that how to integrate it. But for me, as I go back to something you said before, it's always doing. And I've my stance has been continually use artificial intelligence as much as you can that makes sense
Mhm.
in an ethical way that you can learn from. And I think a lot of others out there are struggling with that as they're going through this point right now. And I think you
Sure.
really hit something on the head with it.
Yeah. Well, when you say doing, as we talked about, I am more of the conceptualizing, framing, um, helping people understand the concepts and how they fit together and changing their understanding of things in that way, rather than like the way we tend to talk about doing as a designer. And there
Hmm.
too, my own work has been turning more and more not to doing things with AI and the tooling because that's not what I do. It's not the value that I can create for people. It's not the job that I have. Um, but what I am doing is going back to some of my own work around, like what I talked about in the book that Stephen and I wrote, around understanding and how does AI and tooling in different contexts change that balance around the what we do in our heads and what we do in the world. I wrote some stuff long ago about interaction, and I specifically in a particular framework talked about agents. And I had very much in my mind had this notion I deliberately did not use the word actor, which is common in certain academic areas, right? Actor network theory and things like that. And I used the word agent in the work that I was doing because I could see agents as artificial. I could see the possibility that it wouldn't all be humans. It was quite clear even then, because like a web crawler for a search engine, that's an agent, right? It's a very narrow and specific, right, and not super intelligent, but it does a lot of super valuable work. It automates something that you could never do by hand. And so that was something that was doing something useful to build something else. Now, in my own, so just to do a little step back, in that book, Figure It Out, we did a number of different things. And we had this big picture idea here that design can be a tool for creating things that can help people think better thoughts, plan, reason, solve, etc. But in order to do that, it would be very helpful, right? We argued from the book that the foundation we had was not traditional cognitive science where everything happens in the head, but this new science of embodiment. And so we were trying embodied cognition, extended mind, distributed cognition, et cetera. And so we took that in a very broad take, as saying, if you can change your understanding around this, and we're going to give you a book that lays out a number of different areas in which this is relevant. So one was associations, how we associate things. Another one was representations, the way that we represent things in the world. The third one was interaction, which is my particular area of interest, trying to break down the different kinds of things that people do and build you a framework for the ways that you interact with information as part of your thought process, ways you interact with the world outside of you. And there's a whole bunch of different things. It talks about a difference between pragmatic and epistemic action, and then lists a whole bunch of different epistemic actions and groups them. Epistemic being things you do with the world to create knowledge as part of your understanding process. And then the fourth one was broadly what we called coordination, how all these different kinds of things get coordinated into bigger systems. And there's a bunch of examples around that. But clearly what has happened here with AI is we have a particular piece of technology which can do a whole set of things that we couldn't do before, right? And I see this when I look at this from that perspective. The interactions are all still relevant, but the capabilities of what's on the other side has totally changed. So let me give you an example off the top of my head. Okay. I am a big fan of Kanban boards, especially, and I prefer them quite often on sticky notes. But actually, let me give you a better example. Let's do that. Still sticky notes. An example that I've often given, and we give it in the book, I've used it in talks, is you are a user researcher, you do a series of interviews, you collect a bunch of data points, you write them down on stickies, and you put them on a big wall, right? And you've color coded them in a particular way, maybe one for each participant or whatever it is. And you're standing there and you're looking at them and you need to find a pattern. Okay. If you follow this from traditional cognitive science, where thinking happens just in the head, perception is just input, and action is just output, there is no reason for you to do anything other than this. Stand there, scan the whole wall, and then say, there's the pattern, and then move everything around only because you have to. But we don't do that, right? What we do is we'll go close to something and like, okay, this one I think goes over here. I'm not really sure what to do with these two, so I'm going to hold them in my hand. I'm going to go to this one and go, I don't know what this means. Bob, what do you think? Right. And he'll be like, oh, actually, Susan did that interview, so she knows a better thing. Right. So those are all examples. And so what I tried to do, these are all examples of what we call epistemic actions, rearranging, probing to like get more information, collecting where you hold something temporarily as a cluster, grouping things like to create chunks where that chunk has a representation of something and stands for something else. These are all things that you can do in your head. But even the most experienced researcher cannot do the thing where you don't interact and the interaction is part of making sense, part of the process, part of the thinking. But now, like in that whiteboard, like it literally cannot respond to you, but an AI can. Should it? Where should it? We would take that and you can just throw an AI at it and say, here's the pattern. But does that help you? Maybe. Maybe it does. But maybe it only gets you part of the way. Maybe it gives you some things but misses other things. And what we're lacking here, I think, and this is another part of this nuanced piece around what we're missing in
Hmm.
the AI hype, is where is the human and where is the human in different kinds of situations? We don't really know. So when programmers say, I don't need designers, like you're wrong, right? When designers say, I don't really need programmer, I don't need product managers, programmers, you're also wrong, right? I think the triad that we have worked to build in so many UX teams over the years between product engineering and design is just is not is being broken in many companies, but it needs to be like rejiggered and re-understood. And I think a lot of it is
Hmm.
because
Re-understood.
we don't understand how people work with technology. We think of it as this pragmatic thing
Hmm.
where I'm thinking in my head and I just do this thing. And it wouldn't be great if the machine could just do it for me. How we do this augmentation, cognitive enhancement, we just really don't know yet.
Yeah, I mean, you've said so much there. I recently went to a conference where you're right. I mean, all those blending of roles is happening. However, trying to understand how each role can work together is key. And that does lead me into my next question, which is around advice. So we've got a lot of people out there, whether they're moving into user experience, they've been on the sidelines of the user experience, wondering if you should get back into it. You've had a very interesting career, as you've indicated. What kind of advice would you give to people looking to make a career change or following a path that, as you said, is not the ordinary?
Um, well, I think one of the first pieces of advice to recognize here is, yeah, we're going through a big change in this industry. There's no question about that. We're going through a big change throughout society in a whole bunch of different ways. Because of that, it's going to continue. It's not the only change that's going to happen. I earlier on, I talked about that shift from like to PCs to the web to smartphones, and now AI is this sort of underpinning. But there have been other shifts as well. We had the shift from the web as hyperlink system to the web as like application layer. We had a shift from like desktop bespoke things that were inside organizations to SaaS products. We had a shift from waterfall to agile. We had a shift from everybody working, almost everybody in UX for the longest time worked in small consulting firms and agencies. And then like around 2010, 2012, that all began shifting and that all pretty much got killed off. Not entirely, but it went way down and everybody works in-house, right? The majority, all the heat moved inside organizations to in-house teams. When I got started, there was no role for product managers. People didn't talk about product. Product is like a completely new kind of role that's been developed. So there's always going to be changes. And there is going to be a ton of changes around tooling. I remember, when I was at Kent State, one of the questions we had was, should we be starting to teach Sketch? Right? I left in 2014. Sketch dominated. Where's Sketch today? Right? Sketch got completely gobbled up by Figma. And Figma is going to get gobbled up by something else. I can remember so many different tools. I'm not saying that the tools are bad. I'm not saying that Figma is necessarily dead. These tools often, especially the popular ones, do live in some form. For sure, people still use Photoshop. People still use Illustrator for things. And it just changes. Um, but the tooling is going to change. So don't get yourself too horsed to a particular tool or thinking if I can master this tool, then I will master this job forever. So that's one. Um, a second thing is you're going to see, well, like I said, my path is weird. And I think that my path is weird in the sense that not everybody would even want to do it. Like I like reading academic papers. Not all of them. Some of them are really dry. Like I read one this past spring and I told my wife about it. I told a couple of friends about it. I was like, this thing has just completely lit my brain on fire. It was just an amazing, amazing, fantastic paper. And it was actually by a philosopher. Um, and I don't tend to
Interesting.
read a lot of philosophy papers, but I have been reading more papers in certain areas, especially around philosophy of epistemology. Um, as this paper put it, anyone who's in the field of epistemology for the last decade or so has been thinking to themselves, What the hell is going on? Like, why are there suddenly we are a world filled with like conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxers and like all this reality denying, even when the evidence is right in front of your eyes, right? And so he goes through and begins talking about it and argues that
Hmm.
we should begin thinking about what he called hostile epistemology. Just like many of us know that going into a grocery store, you should think of it as a nutritionally hostile environment. We should be thinking about many of our information environments as epistemologically hostile as well. You can easily fall prey to bad things, even when you think you're not. Um, so most people are not going to be lit up by those ideas, but I do think you should be looking at ideas. And the main reason is because the world is going to change. And as the world changes, that means you need to change the way you see the world, the way you think about the world. Different concepts are going to come into play. Other ones are going to fall away or become less important or become important in a different way. They're going to be connected in different kinds of ways to each other. Like I personally,
I
if I
like that.
continued in the academic path, one of the things that I was quite interested in studying was what I think of as information triage. The world is too big. You can't read all the books. You can't watch all the movies, right? You can't play all the board games, right? You can't try all the apps or listen to all the podcasts, right? But we have such easy access to so much information that you're constantly making choices. Like I've used Freeform to build Kanban boards of books that I am interested in because by visually seeing and grouping them into different topic areas, because when I do that, I get a lot of stuff from the library. When I see them in a typical Kanban fashion, like visualize your work and limit work in progress, by visualizing my work in this Kanban board of things I might want to read, it better allows me to see, oh my God, I could not read all of this stuff, even if I did nothing, even if I was reading 3 books a week for the next 2 years. Like I just couldn't. I'd have to read a book every 2 days. So how do I
Hmm.
prioritize this? How do I find things with the time that I have? There's no triage tools. No tools really let you do this. It's incredible to me how bad these tools are about letting you do this. People are still having workarounds. You want to pick flight options, you go to a flight search tool. Oh my God, there's so many things where I look at those, I'm like, oh, why after 20 years do we still not allow people to do these certain things? It's better, right? And there's filtering and there's lots of different types of things. So I think that you want to look for where are you getting your ideas from that are
Hmm.
helping you understand the world now and how the world is changing? And what practices do you have to distill and synthesize that
Hmm.
so that you can think more clearly about it? Now, in my case, it's books, right? That's not going to be the case for everybody. Take, for example, LinkedIn. A lot of people, you might be going through LinkedIn and you're reading a bunch of different stuff, and there's all kinds of posts. Like right now, like my LinkedIn is just flooded. Every 5 minutes, somebody's got some new post about basically their take on AI, their take on what they're seeing, their take on what people are getting right, their take on what people are getting wrong, their thing about what they do. Like it's just loaded with this stuff. How do you make sense of that? Do you have a process for that? Or are you just scrolling? Oh yeah, and it's just coming in through into your eyeballs and going into your head, but there's no action on the output
Hmm.
where you've got, okay, this is how I can begin to connect the dots. That is the advice that I would have. Tyler Cowen, the economist, who I find interesting and sometimes has very weird opinions, but he reads a ton, um, and he likes to talk about Quake books. Right? A
Okay.
Quake book for him is a book that shakes the foundations of your world so that you can no longer see the world the same way. The books that I mentioned early on, those were Quake books for me. Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman, Things That Make Us Smart by Don Norman. Inmates Are Running the Asylum, maybe not quite so much. Information Architecture for the World Wide Web, The Extended Mind paper by David Chalmers and Andy Clark. a number of other ones. Those ones come to mind. Um, he also notes that as you get older and you see more patterns and you've understood more of the world, you've taken in more, QuakeBucks become harder to find. I think that is also true. So depending on where you are, but I think it's looking for QuakeBooks. One of the strategies that I often use, same with papers, you could do the same thing with stuff for your Substack, stuff for like LinkedIn posts, collect a bunch of them, skim through and like, oh yeah, and then hone in on the ones. When I'm reading books in a particular area, I will often get a stack of like 5, 6, maybe 10. And the deal is like read the first 10 pages. Then go to the next book, read the first 10 pages. Go to the next book, read the first 10 pages. Then figure out which ones actually seem worth your time. This one grabbed me. This one did not. This one's like, okay, right? Triage them rather than I have to read all the way through every single one of these.
All I can say, Carl, is there's so much there. I think the advice of getting ideas and then figuring out how to synthesize them is strong. That, like you said, there's so many content choices out there. How do you make sense of it? But as you've indicated, look for those books, look for those books, look for those ideas that are continue to inspire you. And you've said a lot here on today's podcast that I think many will, for a long time, be inspired. If people want to find more information about you, it sounds like LinkedIn is a good place to go.
Yeah, I'm not on any social stuff at all. Like I'm not on Twitter or never been on TikTok or Facebook or anything like that. My website, I don't even know where the heck that's at. So, yeah, find me on LinkedIn. It's Karl. Last name is Fast, Fast. That's where I'm at. If you want to reach out to me, that actually is the primary reason that I even have a LinkedIn account, is so that if somebody wants to find me, they can go do it there. And I get people who contact me completely out of the blue. And sometimes about the book. Well, actually, often about the book. I've had two this year that I can think of. One who was like, she's a young computer science student who read the book and she was like, oh, I really needed to talk to you about this. And someone who is like a 70-year-old down in Australia who runs a consulting practice helping people in their 50s and 60s build independent businesses to take their expertise. And he was like, this book really helped me. And I was like, I don't understand how. So we're going to sit down and he wants to talk to me about it. Can I
That's
finish with a book
fantastic.
recommendation though? It's
Of
like, speaking of
course.
a Quake book, I'll light your book on fire. Okay. I'm going to briefly give you, I'm going to give two. And the main reason I want to recommend these is because I want to recommend a book that has been a Quake book for me recently, and these are relatively recent books. Whereas the other ones I've recommended, people might have read them or they're older. I still think many of them are worth reading for a variety of reasons, but they're older books. And sometimes older books can be like that for sure. But let me give you two. The first one is The Constitution of Knowledge by Jonathan Rauch, Rauch. This is a book. Here's his basic argument. For all of human history, we have had very bad methods of deciding, agreeing what is right, what is true, what is real. Most of these methods were things like, well, we'll ask the oldest person. We'll throw chicken bones in the dirt. We'll look at the stars. We'll go to the king who is only the king because he's the son of these people, right? We'll look in this particular piece of text, like this particular religious text, and that will give it to us, right? And for most of human history, that didn't work. At least it kind of worked, but it didn't prevent us from killing each other all the time. But about 300 years ago, we began to develop new institutions, new ways of doing this. And we broke those out roughly into four kinds of classes of institutions. One is science, broadly construed, and the scientific method. And we put that institution mostly, but not entirely, into universities. The second one would be is the law. we have courts and judges and judicial processes. In the United States, we have this thing called grand jury. In other countries, they have different ways of doing it, but a way of deciding again through evidence and a process for what is right and true in this particular context, right? Science gives us something about the world as it exists. What do we know? How do we understand this? The third one was, he argued, is journalism. And the fourth one is government. And so these, he points out, are like, this has been the project of the last 300 years.
Hmm.
And so he's writing about this moment that we're in right now, about how many of these things are under attack and often seem to be breaking down. And he's making this defense about why this is good, why these things should endure and be strengthened. And yes, they have weaknesses. So this will, if you are concerned or thinking about, man, like the way knowledge is in the world and how do we know what we know and why people believe weird things and why do we fight about all these kinds of things? He's like, this will give you a very powerful way of looking at that. The second book, which is just from this year, is this one. It is called The Score. It's by a guy named C.T. Nguyen, Nguyen. The subtitle is How to Stop Playing Somebody Else's Game. He is a philosopher at the University of Utah. His actual work, his primary work, is on the theory of games. Why do people play games? And I'd read his previous book, which is very more philosophy-y, right? It's really written like a philosopher. This book is much more accessible. He really nails it for like a big idea book for a wider audience. What he is concerned about here is the quantification of our culture, of our institutions, of every aspect of our life, and how we are winding up playing people's games without realizing it and becoming beholden in work, at home, and at play to these metrics. And his question here is like, why do these metrics, which often seem so useful at the beginning, often turn and strip out all the joy and pleasure in life? Take an example that might have happened to you or many of your listeners. Maybe you get like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, and you're like, I need to get more steps, right? And you're like, I'm going to get my 10,000 steps or 8,000 steps or whatever it is. And one day you come home and you're like, wow, okay, I only got 774 steps. Damn it. I got 226 steps to go. I'm going to have to go walk around the block or run up and down the stairs. You're playing the game,
Hmm.
right? You're trapped in something. And so this is a very thought-provoking book about how the good and the bad, like the tension around these metrics, and how we need to be more careful and more thoughtful about the impact they are having on our everyday life.
So inspiring. Once again, Karl, there is so much here to put your arms around. But to close with those two books,
Uh-huh.
I am so enthralled to discover more about those because they sound like, once again, very contemporary things that are all in everyone's mind and can connect to a lot of other things. As I could see how your mind is, you're connecting this to something else that you probably had down. And this
Yeah,
is,
I read a lot of books and a lot of interesting books. Both of those books were ones, the Constitution of Knowledge from about 5, 6 years ago, this one just this past spring. Both of those were ones which I like lit my brain on fire. And not many books do that these days, where I could just see so many things.
well, I appreciate you sharing everything here today and really appreciate you being on the podcast.
I appreciate you for asking me. Thank you very much. It's been great.
Thank you.